Hello and welcome back to State of the Division. This time bringing you UFC 313. Overall, a super interesting card, which is really surprising considering the number of fighters that had to pull out or that got shuffled around on this card. We still have a super fun main event. Pereira Ankalaev looks to be super interesting and kind of sets up a legacy fight for Pereira, even though he really hasn't been in the UFC comparatively that long. The co-main event, despite a fallout there, we now have a rematch of Gaethje Fiziev, which is super fun. Joshua Van fights Tsuruya, so now we get to kind of see Van look to re-enter the rankings after being removed, unfairly I feel, and Tsuruya looking to kind of cement himself as, oh, I'm here to compete. Even in the beginning of the card, Gutierrez now fights Castaneda, which I think is actually a pretty fun fight, and we could see those fighters go somewhere. You have a heavyweight fight between a new prospect and Curtis Blaydes, which at least I'm excited about, even if it might not be the greatest fight. But before we get into it, we gotta go through the housekeeping and the butcher spill. For housekeeping, I went 8-3 on the last card, with 1 cancellation and 1 draw being wiped from the record, bringing me to 15-8-1 on the year, a good rebound from an overall mediocre start. Moving on to the butcher's bill, a fairly long one, so bear with me as we read my notes. John Matsumoto is off the card due to being pulled to fight at UFC Seattle. Now, Chris Gutierrez, his original opponent, will fight John Castaneda. I believe they are still opening the card. Bruno Silva had to pull out against Joshua Van, and he is being replaced by Tsuruya, who had a fight disappear earlier in the year. Dan Hooker had to pull out of his fight against Justin Gaethje due to broken hand, and is being replaced by Fiziev for the rematch. As it stands now, at the time of recording, those are the only replacements I have. So now getting into the card. Kicking the 3-1-3 off, 21-6-2 Chris El Guapo Gutierrez takes on the late notice replacement, 21-7 John Sexy Mexi Castaneda. Even age across the board with either 1, 3, or 2 inches in height in favor of Gutierrez, with 4 inches in reach going back to Castaneda. Gutierrez comes in as a striking focused grinder with some finishability lurking in the wings. He does only have 3 finished wins in the UFC, 2 of his last 4 wins being finishes though. In the numbers, he works a 4.72 to 2.64, showing how he is able to avoid most of the damage coming his way and limit the success of his opponent's offense. He doesn't get outpaced often, but can be caught with power from some fighters. In terms of the ground, he rolls with a .26 average, but it's very inconsistent in terms of when it shows up. He does carry a 71% takedown defense, which highlights his desire to keep it standing. Castaneda is, as mentioned, the late replacement here and comes across as a ground-focused grinder instead of the feet. 1.79 takedown average highlighting that, and it is in fact a consistent presence in his fights and his wins. He does have a submission win, but it was in 2022, and the submissions are very inconsistent in his game. In his wins, he does have stacked the takedowns in order to rack the ground control time though. Does carry the grappler standard striking totals of 4.67 to 5.22, showing his ability to hang in and work for the ground, but not really pull away or make much progress in terms of the feet. Vegas has this fight about dead even, so to open the card I have no safety net, which is great, but I'm going to roll with Castaneda here. Obviously Castaneda is the late replacement, which is not normally something I go for, but in this case Gutierrez has struggled with getting controlled on the ground before. Not a weakness of his, but something fighters have been able to take advantage of. And with how good Castaneda is at it, I think he has a chance to take advantage of it. Obviously, he's not great on the feet, and Gutierrez does have the 71% takedown defense, but I think Castaneda, coming into this fight, has a good opportunity to stack the takedowns, rack the control time, and get kind of his style of fight that he wants against an opponent that has struggled with that before. 10-1 Dioran Shakur Santos looks to follow up his Contender Series win against 9-3 Osman Hazi Diaz. Santos is 7 years younger, 4 inches shorter, with another 4 inches of reach going to Diaz. Santos is coming into his first non-Contender Series UFC fight and looks to be a grinder as of late, with his last 3 fights going the distance. He does seem to work both the ground and the feet pretty well, outstriking Will Curry 85-41 in his Contender Series win and rocking 3 KO wins in his career. He did only land 1 takedown compared to Curry's 2, but it took 7 more seconds of ground control, 4 minutes 15 to 4 minutes 8. He does have 4 career submission wins, but hasn't landed one since 2017, which is 8 years ago now. Diaz is currently 0-2 in the UFC, with both losses coming by finish. Stylistically, he looks to be a killer-be-killed finisher with 7 career KO wins, and inside the UFC, it's pretty obvious the touch hasn't been there, as he's been outstruck in both of his fights without much success. I don't know much about his ground game, but he has landed 2 submission wins in his career, and hasn't lost by submission either. Vegas likes Santos by a narrow margin, and I will agree. Ozzy hasn't been able to find success in the UFC, which really tilts the needle in Santos in my favor. Santos does only have a Contender Series win, yes, but he seems to have a more well-rounded skill set compared to this killer be killed that's not worked out for Diaz, and he also seems to be able to win the fight in multiple ways here. Diaz's killer be killed, he can get caught by the strike, and while Santos isn't the biggest finisher it seems, he can finish. But he's also proven the ability to control the fight, take it down, and do just enough to outpoint his opponent. 415 to 408. It makes a difference in some of the judges' eyes, and I think that's a path that Santos can take for win. I just think Santos has more paths to victory. 14-2, Myron, the legend Santos, looks to keep his win streak rolling against 8-2, Francis Fire Marshall. Santos is 1 year younger at 24, either dead even height or 2 inches in favor of Marshall, with no difference in reach. Santos is coming off a KO win over Khan Ofli, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, and in his career rocks 8 KO and 6 decision wins, with his only loss being by KO in 2022. In his lone UFC fight, he outstruck his opponent 31-12 for an early second round KO finish. He does seem to be able to push the pace fairly well, or at least in this fight was able to. I don't know about his ground game, but I can at least say he hasn't lost by submission as of yet. Marshall is a ground-focused grinder who has been a bit more decision-focused in the UFC, with 2 of his 3 UFC wins coming by decision. On the ground, he works a 2.68 takedown average with at least 1 takedown in every single one of his wins, though it has climbed to as high as 6 in his Contender Series fight. With that is the obvious chunks of control time, looking at 5 minutes in both of his decision wins. The striking is standard for a ground-focused fighter, a 369 to 416. Which highlights how on the feet he can be outpaced, and he really does rely on that takedown game to keep the fight in range and slow down his opponent's offense. Heavy favorite here is Santos, and quick decision, I will agree. I have to admit that Marshall legitimately has a chance. He has finish ability, which can always come out of nowhere and win him a fight, which is good, and he has a ground game that he's proven to use for decision sakes, which is good. But in this fight, I'm more inclined to roll with Santos' finish ability matching up in this fight, and the money counters in Vegas, which is playing a role here. I don't have a lot of information on Santos, which is unfortunate, but I think going into this fight, we've seen Santos finish people. He looks to have some sort of ground game. He hasn't been submitted, and while Marshall wants to finish you on the ground, if Marshall has to keep going back to the feet, I think more of the ball ends up in Santos' court, and I think Santos has the ability to finish him or take the fight the distance and win by points in that way. Taking us into the prelims. 24-11-0-1, Alex the Great White Morono looks to stop the skid against 21-6, Carlos the Lion Leal. Leal is 4 years younger, with dead even height across the board, with Leal also taking 2 inches in reach. Morono looks to be a striking-focused grinder, though his takedown game does have some presence. Starting on the feet, he works a 4.96 to 4.56, which highlights his willingness to exchange, but also how he has been outpaced on the feet in his last 2 fights especially. I mean, outstruck 123 to 74 and 96 to 108. And in most of his losses, it's tipped decently hard in favor of his opponent. Now, he doesn't get finished often with some really good durability, but also doesn't really have that KO touch, with his last KO finish coming 4 years ago in 2021. He does rely on controlling the fight and taking a sizable lead in most of his wins. He does have a ground game and a submission finish in 2023, but his takedown average sits at a .34 and really seems to be an inconsistent matchup piece that I really only see show up in his losses. He also does seem to struggle a bit with the takedown defense with only a 47% rate. Leal is coming into a second UFC fight off a decision loss to Rinat Ferreira, and I will say it seems to be a fairly high-octane fighter with an emphasis on the feet. 10 career KO wins, with his UFC fight seeing him land 107 significant strikes and go the distance. Does look to be a quick starter, with a good number of his KO wins coming in the first. And looking at the ground, he did land a takedown for 13 seconds of ground control, but does have 2 submission wins in his career. Heavy favorite is Leal at -775, and this one gives me some problems. Morono has lost his last 2, and Leal lost his debut back in October. So really this fight comes down to, do I trust Morono's experience to rebound from the 2 losses? Or do I trust Leal and the prospect of his finishing power? And in the end, I'm going to go with Leal, I think. My reasoning for going with Leal is that we saw him push this super high pace. We saw him fight pretty close, I will admit, with Rinat. And in that fight, he did land 107 strikes. We've seen Morono struggle with fighters who can outpace him on the feet. And I don't fully remember what Leal's ground game is, but he was able to land a takedown, and Morono has struggled with getting disrupted in that same regard. He's not a takedown-heavy fighter. So if Leal's able to land the disruption, if Leal's able to secure takedown time, more things seem to tilt in his direction matching up against Morono. Morono could win, he does have the experience, he has won this style of fight before, But I think looking at it like this, of those two types of fighters, I think more of the cards stack up for Leal. He's proven he has power, he pushes a really quick pace, which we've seen Morono struggle with, and the, while inconsequential 13-second takedown against Morono, he might be able to stack that into a bit more control time, which could matter a bit more. 12-2, Bruno the Hulk Ferreira takes the octagon against 9-4, Aman Superman Petroysan. Ferreira is 2 years younger, 4 or 5 inches shorter depending on the site, with a whopping inch in reach. Going to Ferreira. Ferreira is a finisher through and through, with every single one of his career wins coming by finish. 9 KO, 3 submission. On the feet, he carries a 3.76 to 3.12 and reads like a power puncher with some dynamic ability to catch opponents off guard and drop them in a blink. In that same vein, all his UFC wins have come in the first, though all but one of them came after the 4-minute mark. Now, he can be caught, but it has only happened once. In terms of the ground game, it isn't something he uses too often, with a .50 average, with only 1 landed takedown in 2024. He has struggled against the takedown in his most recent fight against Abismagomedov. Petroysan looks to be a bit more of an all-rounder who relies on limiting his opponent's offense and taking the striking lead with a high pace. In that regard, a 5.95 to 3.36, speaking to that high pace and his ability to sustain that pace throughout the fight. It's a fairly dynamic striking style with the ability to work in kicks and the like. And in the same vein, I do have to acknowledge that he does have KO ability. However, it's only shown up once in the UFC. Rarely is he outpaced on the feet, but the ground game has been effective against him with only a 31% takedown defense. He has proven the ability to survive takedowns and some opponents' ground game, but it has worked against him before. The narrow nod goes to Petroysan, and I think with this one I will be disagreeing. It's not anything against Petroysan. He has the really good ability to slow his opponents down and take control of the fight, but he's been finished in both of his last 2 fights. And with Ferreira being this killer be killed style, he matches up pretty well. He's willing to step in an exchange, he's willing to apply the pressure, which can limit Petroysan's ability to build that striking lead he wants. And while Petroysan can finish people, it's not the most consistent thing with him. I don't know if he'll be able to catch Ferreira with the shot he needs or be able to get the power he needs in an exchange. So in an exchange on the feet, since both fighters don't want to go to the ground, I'm going to give the nod to the killer be kill fighter who seems to have the more consistent power, as well as a pretty good durability, which can limit what Petroysan's able to do. Alright, I'm not exactly sure where this fight's supposed to be on the card, because Sherdog and UFC listed at different spaces, but I'm assuming it stays here. 12-2, Joshua the Fearless Van looks to go to war with 10-0 Ray Tsuruya. Tsuruya is 1 year younger at 22, 2 or 1 inches taller, with 3 inches of reach also going his way. Van is the original part of this fight and comes in as a high-octane striker who likes to go the distance. Starting with the feet, he works an 8.88 to a 5.82, showing that high-octane pace I mentioned, but also his ability to slow down and limit his opponent's offense coming back his way. Now, he doesn't seem to have any major finish ability, only 1 KO finish in the UFC, but in sustaining that pace, he's able to force his opponents to fight from behind. With all that, he also has some sort of takedown game. However, I'm not sure if it's a matchup decision or just a piece in his toolbox that he can use at any time. I mean, he had 3 against Gutierrez, but none against Cody Durden, who did land 2 against him. Though on that note, he does have an 80% takedown defense. Tsuruya is coming in late notice and is a well-rounded fighter capable of controlling the fight over the distance, or finishing it before the bell. His ground game is a major part of that, with a 5.45 average and 4 submission wins, one of those in the UFC. Serves as a major disruption piece, slowing down his opponent's offense and letting him rack up control time. This works with his striking, which is a fairly low total at 2.28 to 1.31, which speaks to how he tries to end the fight quick or slow the fight down to where he remains in the driver's seat throughout. The narrow nod from Vegas here rolls to Van, and being boring, which is a lot of this card, I will be agreeing. It's not a knock against Tsuruya. I can easily see him winning, and if I had the ability to say, I have no idea, flip a coin, it would honestly be this fight on the card. Because in this fight, I think Tsuruya has a really good chance. He matches up really well. Van can be taken down, he can be controlled. Yes, but he's proven the ability to survive that. So the question becomes, can Tsuruya control him well enough on the ground to take him out of the fight? I'm kind of betting on Van being able to survive on the ground to get back to the feet, where I think his high-octane pace doesn't finish often, but the ability to push that pace, land a lot of strikes, and put his opponent on the back foot with the pressure plays into his hand well. And Tsuruya doesn't push a lot of high striking pace. He's a little bit slower, he likes to control the fight more. If Van's able to overwhelm him and put him on the back foot, he's sitting in a good position, and I think he can get to that position in this fight. Ending off the prelims, we have the heavyweights. 18-5-0-1 Curtis Razor Blaydes takes on the newcomer. 12-2-1-1 Rizvan Kuniev. Kuniev is 2 years younger with a dead draw in height and 4 inches in reach, rolling to Blaydes. Blaydes is a decently well-rounded heavyweight with heavy hands and a decent ground game. He has been heavy on the feet as of late with no takedowns in his last 5 fights. That being said, he still averages a 5.69 in the takedown, with a tendency to stack them when he lands and rack up large chunks of control time. I do have to say he has struggled against some other fighters' ground game. Looking at his fight against Jailton Almeida, he was taken down 9 times, but did survive and then win 36 seconds into the second round by KO. That does bring us back to his striking, which sits at a 3.54 to a 1.91, highlighting how he's able to end the fight quick, rarely lets it go long. Now, being a heavyweight, he is in danger of being caught, and has been caught a few times recently by his opponent. Having his long reach does help, but as mentioned, it only takes 1 heavy shot in the heavyweight division. Kuniev doesn't have a lot of numbers for me to go off of, but with 2 Contender Series wins and 6 career KO wins, I think it's safe to call him a finisher. Looking at his striking, he has the aforementioned 6 career KO wins, but also has the ability to sustain the pace through 3 rounds. His first Contender Series bout in 2021, he outstruck his opponent 78-17. Interestingly enough, he tends to go longer in the fights than ending it super quick. Part of that may be his ground game, but I don't have a lot of info on that. In that first Contender Series bout, he landed 3 takedowns for 6 minutes of ground control and has 2 career submission wins. Other than those, I don't have a lot of info on his takedown game. Vegas favorite is Blaydes, and out of equal parts favoritism and legitimate logical reasoning, I will agree. Now, for the favoritism, Blaydes is one of my favorite active fighters, one of my favorite fighters in the heavyweight division, and probably one of my fighters I'm most looking forward to seeing on a given card. I think he puts on fun fights and you're always in for something going on in them. For actual logical reasoning, Blaydes is a seasoned heavyweight fighter. He's fought in the UFC for a while and has a good amount of experience. Blaydes also has that decent ground game I mentioned. He's a pretty good wrestler, able to match up with a good number of fighters. So I don't know if Kuniev's ground game is able to overcome Blaydes, and if Blaydes can take control there, he will, and he will win the fight that way. When it comes to the hands, that's where I think most of the danger is. But again, we have here, it always seems to be a wash in the heavyweight. Everyone's got heavy hands, so it comes down to experience and advantages. And I think Blaydes has a 4-inch reach advantage, and he's been able to work that decently in some other fights. Obviously, against people like Aspinall, it hasn't worked, but I'm thinking in this fight against a rookie, it can play into his advantage, mixed with his ground game and the pressure he can apply. I think Blaydes has a better chance to win. Opening up the main card, 32-16-1-1 King Green looks for the rebound against 11-1 Mauricio Ruffy. Ruffy is 10 years younger, a whole inch taller with 4 inches in reach, also going his way. Green is the old hand here and reads like a kill-or-be-killed fighter with heavy hands. Now, he can go the distance for the win, but it's not the most common outcome for him. Instead, he relies on a 6.43 to 3.73 in striking with some serious power. And with that is the tendency to end the fight early and not let it go on long, with most wins and losses coming early in the fight. Of course, being kill or be killed means that he is a danger of being caught and put away if his opponent has that power. Green does have a ground game with 1.23 takedown average, but it seems to be very much a matchup or recovery option compared to a consistent piece. This has also worked against him, with his most recent loss having him lose by triangle choke despite having the only landed takedown in the fight. Ruffy is very much a swing and bang fighter, and if he had more losses, I'd call him a kill or be killed fighter. He racks a 4.70 to 4.76 in striking, highlighting the reliance on power and the tendency to eat shots coming back at him. Now, he only has been outstruck once in the UFC, in his most recent fight, but he still seems to take a decent amount of damage either way. He has no takedowns on record, but has recorded a 100% takedown defense so far. Vegas likes Ruffy by a decent margin, and I know it's boring, but I'm going to agree. It's not that I'm completely discounting Green in this fight, but Ruffy pushes a much quicker pace, pushes the action a lot more, and we've seen Green get caught by that. We've seen Green get caught on the back foot, get caught in power exchanges. We've seen Green get pushed back. So I'm going to pick the fighter with the higher motor, the hotter hand, and I don't know his takedown ability. He has the 100% defense, which shuts down a portion of Green's game, but I don't know if he'll shoot a takedown. I don't know if he'll attempt a submission. If he can, I think that's just a little bit more tilting the needle in his favor. So in the end, I'm gonna pick Ruffy. 14-4-1, Amanda Hino Lemos squares off against 17-5, Yasmin Lucindo. Lucindo is 14 years younger at 23. Either a dead draw in height or 1 inch in favor of Lemos, with the reach being a definite inch in favor of Lucindo. Lemos looks to be a bit of an all-rounder finisher, with 5 of her last 8 wins all being by finish, 3 of them by KO and 2 by submission. Though I must mention the last finished win was in November 2022. Looking at the striking first, she rolls with a 3.16 to a 3.87, which speaks to her ability to draw on power in her striking, but also the ability for some opponents to shut her game down and take the striking lead, looking specifically at that Zhang fight. There is also the ground game, which sits at a 0.90, which despite the low number is a decently recurring piece of her arsenal that enables her to disrupt her opponent's offense. She's landed 3 takedowns in her last 4 fights for 2 wins and 2 losses. Those takedowns are spread across 2 fights though. Lucindo is more of a control focused grinder with a focus on that ground game. A 2.40 takedown average with takedowns in every single one of her UFC wins, helping highlight the focus on that aspect. She does tend to stack them up when she lands, and there is a looming submission threat, though she has only landed 3 total in her career. She racks a 3.52 to 2.91 in striking, which is decent and shows she's able to have some success on the feet. A big part of this is how she slows down the overall offense down and limits her opponent's ability to amass a lot of strikes. Vegas tilts a narrow nod to Lucindo, and I'm going to agree, even though I know it's boring. Lemos has a chance, but we've seen Lemos in the same hand struggle with fighters who are able to take her down and control her. We saw it against Zhang Weili, we saw it against Jandiroba. She was taken down, she couldn't get her offense going, and she couldn't get to the feet and strike. Lucindo is not exactly those fighters for sure, but she's a similar type of fighter. Heavy on the takedowns, heavy on the control. When they go to the ground, I'm not sure Lemos is going to be able to prevent Lucindo from getting her control time, putting her in a bad position, getting the points and getting the time she needs to win the fight by decision or even work it to a submission threat. Lemos can win, yes, Lemos has the skill to win, but we've seen Lemos struggle with this type of fighter, and Lucindo is a very good example of a control-focused ground fighter. She gets the takedown, she stacks them, and she just racks it up. And we've seen Lemos struggle with that, so I have more confidence in Lucindo winning. 14-8, Jalen the Tarantula Turner takes on the streaking 16-5 Ignacio La Huala Bahamondes. Bahamondes is 2 years younger at 27, but Turner takes 2 inches in height, or there might not be a difference, and SureDog has him 6'3 to 6'1 in favor of Turner, but UFC stats has him dead even across the board. Reach, however, is 2 inches in favor of Turner. Turner is a killer-be-killed finisher with some dangerous power he can bring out at any time, with all 7 of his UFC wins being finishes. On the feet, he racks a 5.60 to a 4.57, showing that while he does use power a lot, he is capable of taking striking leads or staying close to his opponent when they do get ahead. It is worth noting that opponents are able to slow him down with takedowns or even keep a higher pace and take the lead away from him. And of course, he can be finished, as with all killer-be-killed fighters. Now, unlike some other killer-be-killed fighters, he does also have a ground game with a 0.79 takedown average and some submission ability. It isn't the most consistent piece of his game, but it is something that has shown up and been effective in providing him recovery time or disruption to retake control of a fight. This is very similar with a killer-be-killed disposition and some dynamic and powerful striking. One difference that he seems to be a little higher pace and so far in the UFC, at least so far in the UFC, and a little more unwilling to exchange with a 7.17 to a 4.41 on the feet. With that, you can see the pace he can push into the later rounds, but also the fact that he packs some nice KO power with the ability to swarm his opponent with punches and put them away through that as well. He doesn't have an attempted UFC takedown, but has recorded a guillotine choke finish. This paired with an 85% takedown defense show his ability to counter his opponent's ground game as well as generate offense off of it. Bahamondes is the recipient of a small Vegas nod, and this fight is super close in my opinion. Both guys can finish the fight quick, both guys have that finishing touch in them. So I think the big thing for me, it comes down to pace and the ability to avoid getting hit back. And on that regard, I'm going to roll with Vegas and go with Bahamondes. Bahamondes has that higher pace, the 7.17 I mentioned, and while the numbers aren't everything, we've seen Turner struggle with fighters who push a quicker pace and keep that pace up round after round, and I think Bahamondes can do that. Bahamondes also statistically takes less punishment. Again, the numbers aren't everything, but stylistically, Turner seems a bit more willing to exchange and let his power be the decider. Bahamondes is a bit less willing to let power be the only decider and tries to keep himself out of damage a little bit more. Obviously, if Turner pushes the action, he can swing things. This fight's super close. It can really go either way. I'm giving the nod to Bahamondes based on his pace and the fact he takes a little less damage than Turner does in most of his fights. In the co-main event, 25-5 Justin the Highlight Gaethje takes on the late notice rematch with 12-3 Rafael Adamant Fiziev. Fiziev is 5 years younger, 3 inches shorter, with a single inch in reach heading back his way. There's not a lot to say about Gaethje that hasn't already been said by myself or actual commentators. He's a high-octane, killer-be-killed finisher who thrives on getting into firefights with his opponents. In the numbers, he works a 6.79 to a 7.46, which shows the aggressive pace he can push, but also how he can be swarmed by his opponent. His power can keep him in the fight, and that is bolstered by a dynamic striking style that can catch an opponent in the blink of an eye. Now, despite the .11 takedown average, he has one career takedown attempt in the UFC with a 75% takedown defense, showing how he wants to keep moving on the feet. Fiziev is very much the same case, with 4 of his 6 UFC wins ending by finish. He's not as high octane with a 4.90 to 4.97, showing a willingness to exchange and the tendency to keep those fights close. On the same note, he doesn't seem to really end quick, with most of his fights going into the later rounds. As such, he can be caught and will take damage really no matter what. He does have a small takedown game with a .29 average. It hasn't shown up often, but it's shown up enough for me to consider it a recovery disruption tool. Vegas gives the narrowest of nods to Fiziev in this rematch, and I will be disagreeing and running with Gaethje here. Since the rematch, Gaethje has gone 1-1 and Fiziev has gone 0-2, both against very good competition. And obviously both fighters are similar with KO power and the willingness to wade into fire to land their shots. But here I think Gaethje sets himself apart with his pace being a little bit higher, and now he's proven himself to be able to manage a situation to sustain his offense going in. His chin has held up, he's been able to go into those later rounds, and in this rematch, I don't think much has changed besides a year between the fights, really. I think both fighters have had hard firefights since, but I think Gaethje has proven that he is still Justin Gaethje, and Fiziev has proven he's still Fiziev. And I don't see this fight going too different unless Fiziev lands that shot that he needs that he wasn't able to land the first time. And for the main event, a showdown between 12-2 light heavyweight champion Alex Poatan Pereira and 19-1 Magomed Ankalaev. 5 years of age in favor of Ankalaev, 1 inch of height going to Pereira with 4 inches of reach also heading his way. Pereira is a heavy-handed striker capable of ending the fight in an instant with an explosive and dynamic style. With the striking carries a 5.46 to 3.44, showing his ability to manage his opponent and avoid a decent amount of damage coming back his way. You see that with the difference between him and his opponent in most fights, his last fight against Khalil Roundtree having a 127 to 61 spread of strike. Obviously, normally they don't get that high with mostly first round finishes, but he still has a striking lead in those fights. Other high-octane fighters can close the gap a bit, Pereira plus Chaka 1 being a 38-30 spread in strikes before the end of it. Now, he does have a fairly dynamic style with a kickboxing background and ability to mix in those moves to catch an opponent off guard. Does technically have a .14 takedown average, but that is mostly a lie with his lone takedown coming in 2022 in a different weight class against Israel Adesanya. I imagine he could still shoot a takedown, but it's certainly not a standard part of the game plan. Though worth noting is the 70% takedown defense and the times he's been able to survive the ground. Ankalaev is also a striker with some finishability, but I'm more inclined to describe him as a measured striker more than willing to take it the distance. 3.64 to 2.37 in striking shows off the more measured style where he slows the pace down and really keeps himself in the driver's seat. His opponent's totals do get close to his, but in the fight he never really feels like they are in control. Also helping slow it down is a .92 takedown average, which does seem very matchup based, but also has been effective when pulled out for large chunks of control time. Vegas has this dead even, and I'm legitimately a little torn over this. But I'm going to go with Pereira. I have to acknowledge that Ankalaev's ground game gives me a lot of pause. Pereira has survived the ground game. He survived against Jan Blachowicz. Ankalaev is similar in regards to his ability to control a fight on the ground. Not quite the same takedown style and all that, but his ability to control the fight in the ground and slow it down there is really dangerous. Pereira's proven the ability to survive, and I think he could get back to the feet and continue fighting. I think. When it comes to the feet, though, both fighters are different and similar, if that makes sense. Ankalaev, as I've mentioned, is very measured. He doesn't really explode for a super high quantity of strikes. He doesn't get these massive numbers, but he keeps it kind of simple, landing precise shots in that. Pereira's a little more higher pace, willing to step in, exchange, and land heavier shots. And I think in this fight, Ankalaev has the slight disadvantage in that regard. I don't know if that his willingness to pick and choose shots so much is going to be as effective as someone who's able to walk in and exchange and he definitely seems to be able to draw on that power more than Ankalaev has. Ankalaev is someone I would call a finisher, but I definitely would call Pereira a finisher. And I think Pereira's powers might cause some problems for Ankalaev if they try to step in and exchange. So I think on the feet, I give the nod to Pereira. On the ground, I give the nod to Ankalaev. Both fighters do tend to prefer the feet, so I'm going to give the nod to Pereira. Well, in the end, that's UFC 313. And I hope you see what I mean, that this might be one of the best cards of the year. From top to bottom, it's at least interesting. It's a lot of fun matchups. And despite the injuries and despite the dropouts and despite everything that went pear-shaped, it's an interesting card. It has some interesting promise. We have some potential new champions, some potential new contenders. We have guys fighting for rankings. We have newcomers looking to prove a point. A heavyweight match that I'm at least looking forward to. So tell me what you think in the comments, what I got right, what I got wrong, what I agree with, what you don't. But in the end, have a great fight.